If you're not willing to look stupid, nothing great is ever going to happen to you. Those are the words of the fictional Dr. Gregory House, and they come to mind as I think about what I want to share with you today. I want to go back in time just a little bit to 2010, when I put a stake in the ground for my business and named myself the introvert entrepreneur. One of the first calls I made was to an extroverted friend who I knew did improv classes, because I thought it would be good to have some improv skills in my back pocket, particularly when it came to networking. Networking is an activity that most introverts love to hate, and I knew that improv skills might help me to just think on my feet better and be more comfortable with the unknown. What happened, though, is that I learned so much more than just thinking on my feet. I learned how important it is to release attachment, to get comfortable with making mistakes and, yes, looking stupid, and to be present to what is in the environment. Over the years, I've come to realize that these lessons not only apply to networking and business, but they apply to life. And in particular, they apply to photography. We learn a lot about the rules of photography, and these aren't necessarily rules that I want to share, but they are basic improv principles that can make a huge difference in how you see the world around you and how you approach your relationship with your photography. So in that spirit, I'm going to share 5 of the basic improv principles that I've worked with the most, and talk a little bit about how they apply to photography. And as I start to do this, I do want to give a quick shout out to Matt Payne and his F-Stop Collaborate and Listen podcast. I had the privilege of having a really wonderful and wide-ranging conversation with him about identity and labels as artists and as photographers. And that's live now. And I put a link down below in the description. And I bring that up partly because I really hope that you'll check that out. Matt does an awesome job with these interviews and with his channel. And partly because I do talk a little bit about these improv principles, but this is a chance to do a deeper dive. The first principle that I want to share is yes and. And it's probably the improv principle that has, of all of them, made its way the most into the mainstream, almost to the point where it can sound a little cliche and be brushed off. But if we really embrace it, it can have a profound impact on the way that we see the world. When we say yes and, we are accepting the offer of the moment. We're saying, yes, I see you and I hear you, and I am going to add to what you just shared. There's a great scene in season 2, episode 9 of the American version of The Office, where our protagonist, Michael Scott, is in an improv class. And one of his colleagues begins a skit by pretending she's a little girl skipping and licking a lollipop. And Michael just comes in on the scene and puts his hands out like this and says, you're under arrest, or, whatever he says. But he basically is demonstrating the opposite of yes and. Instead of building on what the woman was doing with being a child and licking her lollipop, he decided he was going to play FBI. He thought this will be funnier than what she has done. So he saw her offer, he rejected it, and he went in his own direction. And we can see right there in that, few minute segment how much going against what's offered to you shuts down the energy. It shuts down the flow of the scene in this case. But if you've ever been in a conversation or in a relationship where offers were consistently rejected, you know what that feels like to have that energy squash. So how does this translate over into photography? Maybe you get up before dawn and you drive to the seaside and you're hoping for that amazing sunrise, but instead you're greeted with a downpour. Or you discover once you're on location that even though you thought you had meticulously packed up your gear, you are missing the lens that you are really looking forward to using at that particular scene. So saying no in those situations and giving yourself over to frustration shuts down your energy in very much the same way that Michael Scott did when he came in and said, FBI, you're under arrest. There's no place to go from there, and all of the possibilities are cut off. But when you say yes, and you say, okay, it's raining. Where is shelter that I can hang out in until it stops? What can I do from my car and through the car windows and the rain showing up on there? Is there an indoor place that's nearby that maybe I go to instead that might be fun to take photographs at? Or you forgot your lens. Okay, I forgot my lens. Let's see what else I have in my bag. What would happen if I used this one this time? And one of the things that I often get sort of frustrated with is it's a beautiful cloudy day and I'm outside in a garden and the sun comes blazing out. I could say no and get frustrated, or I could say yes and. So how can I leverage the sun being out? By focusing on shadows or high contrast, or getting in closer and using my body as the shade. So yes and requires that we release attachment to what we wish were true and instead work with what is true and what's offered to us. And we accept that gift and we commit to working with it and seeing where it takes us. The second principle is make the other person look good. There's an obvious correlation between this principle and any photography that features people. I sometimes do event photography, and I'm always conscious of not catching someone in a less than flattering pose, which is really hard when you're doing events where people are eating and drinking and talking a lot. And so those normal activities go by in a flash, and they're frozen in time forever once I, press the shutter. And so, of course, we know, make the other person look good. We abide by this principle. We edit those photos out and we keep the images where people look their best. Now, we can substitute, of course, people for scene or subject, whatever it is that we're photographing, making it look good. And I realize, though, that making something look good is not always the prime objective. We might be capturing something that is, specifically unglamorous or gritty or sad or even ugly. And in that case, making the subject look good just means that you are approaching it with full intent. You have an intention behind it. You're taking your time. You're really seeing what you want to communicate. You're taking time to look at those angles and shadows and light and lines until you find that perspective that best tells the story and makes it look good. In other words, aligned with your intention. The third principle is forward the action. Now, this is a confession time because I'm really hoping that I'm not alone in having a Lightroom catalog that evokes the movie Groundhog Day, where you have frame after frame after frame that almost basically looks the same. Sometimes they are the same, and sometimes there's just the tiniest little bit of difference. Like I maybe moved my camera a fraction of an inch, or I adjusted my shutter speed maybe a notch. I'm engaged in some sort of magical thinking that if I just press the shutter enough times, the right image is going to result, or that I can itsy bitsy tweak my way into the image that I see in my mind's eye. And yeah, sometimes that does happen. Sometimes it's very minor adjustments. But do I really need 20 versions of essentially the same capture to get there? I think of it as like death from 1,000 exposures. I remember hearing about a photographer a few years ago who says he tries not to take the same capture twice. That each time he presses the shutter, there has to be something that's markedly different about his settings or his perspective. And so that's how I translate forward the action into photography practice. It means to keep things moving ahead and avoid spinning our wheels by taking 100 versions of the same scene without significantly advancing the plot line of what we're trying to communicate. And it might sound contrary, but you might have heard a variation on the phrase, slow down to speed up. If we slow down, we're less likely to work out our composition by pressing the shutter 100 times, and more likely to pull the camera away from us, to slow down, take our time, and explore different relationships with what is in front of us. We slow down to observe more, and then we press the shutter when there's something interesting or something new to capture. That will result in fewer images that forward the action, that more quickly expand on the story, and rather than keep things visually running in place. I suggest taking a look at old contact sheets. Just Google, film contact sheets photography, and I'll put a link to a few resources in the description. But photographers obviously only had film to work with, and they couldn't afford to tweak and do 100 exposures of the same thing in camera. They had to keep things moving, and they had to keep trying different ideas. And so maybe once they found a composition that they could tell was working, some variations would follow. But there were often wild differences from one frame to the next, even with a model who was posing. The limitations of film meant that they had to make the most of every frame. And we've lost that with, our memory cards that can hold thousands and thousands of images in just a tiny little sliver of plastic. They had to make the most of every frame. So they had to loosen up. And they had to forward the action. This next one is one that I mentioned in my interview with Matt Payne, and that is be average. Because let's get real. We all hope that when we go out with our cameras that we're going to come home not just with a few usable images, but fantastic images. Like, that's what we want. That's what, part of what gives us a thrill is when we see something that really sparks our excitement. We hope for photos that get some attention when we share them on social media, or that we can enter into a contest, or might look good printed out and framed and maybe even sold to someone. And when we go out in the field with that in mind, we start chasing that winning capture and might even get attached to a vision of photographic perfection. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting or striving for images that we are proud of and that we feel like are amazing. We all want to be proud of what we produce and see making better images as a sign of our progress. And yet, there is tremendous value in seeing how we can relieve the pressure that we put on ourselves to be amazing, and instead embrace just being average. If you watch an improv skit and there's someone who's over the top and exerting a lot of energy, especially trying to be funny, it often causes us to squirm in our seats a little bit. And you might even think to yourself, I know I've thought to myself, they're trying too hard. I wish they would just relax. And it's easy to see when others are getting worked up, but it's sometimes hard to see it in ourselves. We see that they are performing, that they're mugging it up for the camera. But the moments that really stick with us and that kind of catch us off guard are the average ones, the quieter ones. They're the ordinary conversations and looks and gestures. In the process of allowing the average to be seen, it often becomes funny or poignant or even profound. The ridiculous gets the attention, but the average has the potential to be meaningful and to stand that test of time. Here's an experience I had recently with being average. I was taking the Amtrak between where I live in Muskegon, Michigan to Chicago. And it's about a 3-hour train ride. And in this case, I was on my way back after a day of photographing in Chicago. So we're somewhere in southwestern Michigan, and something catches my eye out the window. So, of course, I decide to take out my camera. I started pointing my camera out the window and just started snapping. I probably took around 500 or 600 images over the course of an hour. And I didn't know what I was getting. And if you've ever taken a train ride like that, you're going through probably dozens and dozens of little tiny communities. And there are some homes that are, rather close to the tracks, or there are warehouses or farms, parking lots and whatnot. So it's not exactly a glamorous scene. It's actually a very average scene. It's kind of like we're seeing the backyard of everybody's front yard. We all put on that good front yard face, but then the backyard might be a little rough around the edges. I didn't know what I was getting. I just knew that maybe something was going to be there. When I got home and took a look at those images, a couple of things stood out to me. One was that averageness of all of the scenes, but the second was power lines. I kept seeing, I had several images where the power lines were the dominant thing that you noticed in the frame. And so that led me to see kind of three stories in each one of those images. One was about the visual clutter that we live with, that's so ubiquitous that we hardly notice it anymore. Another story was about being surrounded by all those wires in our supposedly wireless world. And a third was about the vulnerability of those wires, how close they were to train tracks, to homes, to businesses, to equipment and automobiles and all sorts of things. And thinking about the vulnerability of those lines in severe weather, which is what we learned from the Maui fires that were caused by severe weather damaging power lines. So those stories combined make for, very ordinary scenes becoming something a little bit more extraordinary because they're telling a story. They're worth saving and sharing. They freeze a moment in time that most of us don't notice because, just like on the train, we're just kind of whizzing by. And when we see those quieter, average moments that we usually just pass by, they ask us to stop and think about, what have we stopped seeing? And how do we feel about it once we notice it? That's the power of being average and making a practice of being average when it comes to our photography. We release expectations and pressure and just become present to what's in front of us. We enter into partnership with what is. And then we make more room for the average. And when we do that, we're also making more room to stumble upon the uniquely compelling and the extraordinary. And then we have our final, fifth and final improv principle, and that is dare to fail. This, as it sounds like, is all about experimentation and taking risks. You're sticking your neck out without knowing what's going to happen. It might seem like you're leaping without a net, but the way I interpret this particular principle is that it is telling you, this is the net. You have permission to fail. It's okay. You will fall down 7 times, get up 8. And it's kind of a responsibility to fail on our way to figuring out who we are and what we have to say. We're invited to fail fast, fail often, and fail spectacularly if we're able, because that means we're really putting ourselves out there. Now, with this principle, I find myself over the years, I don't even like the word fail because it's so loaded with negative emotion. We know intellectually that failure is part of our journey, but it takes an emotional hit. We know that it's just the result of us trying something new and that it happens to everyone. But emotionally, we cringe and we feel like it's something that we want to avoid. Even if we say, I don't mind failing, most people don't like to fail. So I suggest that we reframe failure so that we can take some of the sting out of it. I took a basic mediation course about 7 years ago, and it taught me a definition of conflict that I think applies here and can help us to reframe failure. Now, most people would agree that conflict is another emotionally charged idea. But if we objectively boil down conflict to what it is, it's very simple. It's what happens when expectations aren't met. I expected A to happen, and instead B happened. And so there's dissonance. There's conflict. It's not good or bad. It's just information. And it's how I respond to it that determines if it is emotional. Now, we're not robots, so disappointment is a natural reaction. And so is frustration and anxiety and embarrassment. But are those our only options when we mess up? Now, what if failure had a similar definition? What if we came to see it as a form of conflict that plays out when we hope for one thing, we plan for one thing, and something different happens? It's not a verdict on our skill or our creativity or our potential. It's just information, and we can decide what to do with it. Now, here's the challenge, whether we're talking about improv or photography. This invitation to dare to fail hits the nerve that is our ego. One of my favorite quotes about the challenges of our ego comes from Father Richard Rohr, who wrote, "The human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to falling, to changing, or dying. The ego is that part of you that loves the status quo, even when it's not working." Taking a risk is the last thing our ego wants, because taking a risk challenges that status quo. It's rocking the boat, and it makes us vulnerable. Our ego might get bruised because of real or perceived rejection. And so we avoid putting ourselves out there because in our imagination, of course we can have a solo exhibit. Of course we can win the top prize or sell out all of our prints or go viral. But if we step outside of our egocentric imagination into the real world, then we're opening ourselves up to that possibility that we're not ready for that solo exhibition. We're not quite at the level where we're going to win a competition, or that people aren't particularly interested in the images that we're making, and certainly not interested enough to buy them. And so we stay small. And we avoid that potential conflict of what our imagination is telling us, where we are always winning, and what reality might tell us if we put ourselves out there. And so we do keep to the status quo, even though it's not working for the part of us that wants our creative work and expression to be seen and heard and appreciated and discussed and debated and purchased and shared. Daring to fail is a requirement for us as artists. We can't play it safe and small. We have to keep showing up and remembering why we do what we do. We do it because we have to. Yes, we want others to like and find meaning in our work. But if that's what we lead with, if that's our motivation, then we're going to end up diluting our vision in favor of what's popular. I've come to believe that that might be part of what people mean when they say create for yourself and don't care what other people think. I've thought a lot about that idea, and I will share more in a future episode, because I do think that there's a yes and element to that statement. But for now, consider dare to fail encouragement, to dare to create art that matters to you. And if others like it, so be it. And if they don't like it, so be it. You determine the worth of your work, not others. Whether I'm writing or podcasting or teaching or coaching, I'm often sharing what I need to hear and learn. So I can't say that I live by these principles with absolute consistency. They are absolutely a work in progress, and they're equal parts habits that I'm starting to form and aspirations that are going to take a lifetime of work to achieve. And I think that that is probably going to be true for you as well. So when you think about these principles, are there any that stand out to you that you're ready to practice? Or maybe there are ones that you already put into play. Are you a yes and type of person? Do you practice intention and patience to make the other person or the subject or the scene look good? Do you forward the action by building on what you've already done rather than repeating what you've already done? Are you willing to be average, to spend time with the ordinary? And how do you handle failure when your expectations for an image or an experience don't pan out? Which one of these do you want to stretch into? What do you believe will make the biggest difference in your photography? And which one are you committed to trying? I invite you to share your experiences and your ideas in the comments and your commitments, and let us know which improv principle resonates with you and that you plan to be practicing. I would love to hear from you. I'm really proud that this channel is sponsored in part by Nature Photography Classes and their Inspired Creator Grant. You can learn more or submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspired-creator. And there's a link in the description below. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've taken away something useful, and I look forward to seeing you next time.